People never dreamed that the river could get that high. They never dreamed that there would be a rain that wouldn't stop for days and days. They couldn't stop the rain. They couldn't stop the flood.
Among the people like myself, of my age, it's a major landmark. It's a major landmark. 2/3 of our city was underwater. It was huge.
It rained every day, 31 days in January. Oh, it rained and rained and rained and rained.
The radio said, the water is coming over the flood wall. Your belongings are not your priority. Get out and save yourself.
We have referred to this, we again being my friends, is it made us strong. We use that term a lot. It made us strong.
Our area was just one of 1,000 that was being hit.
Well, it affected the whole family and the whole town and my father's business. And, a total loss for many people.
We didn't really have that much to start out with, and then the flood took away part of that.
37 was certainly the big one for us. All those communities, all the way up the Ohio River, all the way up to Pittsburgh, they all had the flood.
The Ohio River begins its journey in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and flows for nearly 1,000 miles until it joins the Mississippi in southern Illinois. The river drains an area of 204,000 square miles and is relied upon to provide drinking water, hydroelectric power, and transportation for millions of people. While the Ohio is a powerful ally to the communities along its banks, it is also a conduit for one of the most devastating and uncontrollable forces of nature: floods. Despite modern advances in flood control, including dams, levees, and flood walls, flooding remains a part of the life experience of those who live along the river.
It was a sight that you never expect to see again, all the houses sticking up out of the water. And I was 15, but I didn't realize all the devastation and the hardships it's going to cause everybody. I didn't think about that. I just hoped it'd hurry up and get down so I can get back on dry land.
Portsmouth, Ohio, is a quintessential American river community located at the confluence of the Ohio and Scioto rivers in the south-central part of the state. Like the nearby communities of Ironton, Ohio, Ashland, Kentucky, and Huntington, West Virginia, Portsmouth's history is closely linked to the river.
The river and commerce along the river has always informed the Portsmouth community in one way or another. It's tremendously important to our identity, and we know something of its historical significance.
We like to think of Portsmouth as being a river town that has had a lot of historical significance through the years, back through the 19th century and into the 20th century. Portsmouth was a fairly major port along the Ohio River.
Like many communities along the Ohio, Portsmouth also has a long history of battling the river's floodwaters, having experienced major floods in 1884, 1907, and 1913.
If you go back in the history of Portsmouth, there were regular floods from the founding of this community at the beginning of the 19th century. The community has always kind of paced itself and even accommodated the flooding of the river.
In response to the flood of 1913, the Army Corps of Engineers constructed a massive 62-foot flood wall and a system of pumping stations designed to protect the city from the river. Portsmouth's flood control plan had worked and protected the city for 24 years.
It kept out many high water, but it had always done the job up to this time.
Y'all took it for granted that we were safe after the flood wall was put up.
However, in 1937, massive flood waters would return to the communities along the Ohio, and the city would be tested once again in a battle of survival against the mighty Ohio River.
They didn't expect it to get so high. That was unheard of for that river to get that high. It came right over that flood wall that the city had built to protect it. It came right over that flood wall.
In 1937, Portsmouth had a population of 42,000. Despite the Depression, the city remained vibrant and industry kept the town working.
Our population at that time was approximately twice what it is today. You know, I mean, the shoe factories were still going, the steel mill was still going. Chillicothe Street was a busy, busy street full of shops, stores, independent stores. This was quite a business community.
There was a time back in the 20s and the 30s of the 20th century when Portsmouth was considered the industrial center between Cincinnati and Pittsburgh. After all, there were steel mills here, shoe factories, railroads with switch yards and so on, repair shops.
Portsmouth, in spite of the Depression, had a lot of industry then. The mill and Harbison Walker, 2 shoe factories, you know, and they had jobs.
Portsmouth was on the move, and thoughts of a flood were on few people's minds. The city almost seemed invincible. After all, the flood wall had been doing its job, protecting Portsmouth for 24 years.
I was about 15 years old, and we didn't dream that the water was going to get that high because we had a flood wall at that time.
1937 started off as a very wet year for the Ohio River Valley. By the 21st of January, it had been raining in Portsmouth for nearly a month straight, and the city's trust in the flood wall was finally beginning to break. The Portsmouth Times reported that the Ohio River was at 59.77 feet and rising 1/10 of a foot an hour. Water was coming dangerously close to reaching the top of the 62-foot flood wall.
It was what I understand the weather department calls a trough. You know, I mean, it just didn't move. It just continued to rain day and night for weeks. And it was over the whole Ohio River watershed, which is a large watershed.
Frank Sheehan, the city manager, issued a warning in the newspaper. "We will continue to keep water out of the city as long as we possibly can, but if it appears certain that the river will go above the 62-foot mark, which our flood wall protects, there is nothing that can be done to prevent a flood."
They were told when they were going to let the water come through. I did spend time with a group filling sandbags. We did a lot of sandbag work down there. All of us pitched in.
The Portsmouth Times informed its readers that a series of warning signals in the form of factory and locomotive whistles would be sounded if a flood was inevitable. If the river reached a stage of approximately 61.5 feet, sewer valves located throughout the city would have to be opened in order to let the water enter Portsmouth in a controlled fashion. The city prepared for the worst as the rain continued to fall and the water continued to rise.
Let me state that the following pages represent my personal story of Portsmouth, Ohio's greatest flood. They were written at the exact time stated. Some pages were typed by candlelight, others by coal oil light in the upstairs room at 521 4th Street. If you were in the flood, possibly it will recall some of your own experiences. If you were not in the flood area, possibly it will be interesting anyway as to just what goes on in such a case. Late to work on account of a trip down to Old Man River to read the gauge. Looks bad. Still raining and river rising at a strong inch per hour.
By the evening of Thursday, January 21st, it was clear to many people in Portsmouth that they better prepare for the inevitable.
We were moving everything upstairs because my mother said, we'll do just like we did in the 13th flood. And surely it won't get any higher than it did in the 13th flood. And then when the water goes out, well, we'll come down and clean the place out and move everything back downstairs again. Well, it didn't turn out that way.
Warning signals are blowing. A signal that the water will have to be let into the city. We have approximately 6 hours grace. Can't stick it out much longer, so to bed. Still raining. Harder.
As reported in the Cleveland Plain Dealer, City Manager Frank Sheehan decided that the long battle to prevent water from topping the 3-mile-long flood wall was hopeless. At 3:15 a.m., sewer valves were opened and the water began finding its way into the city.
6 a.m. Here she comes. Water's appearing through the 4th and Market Street sewers. Water now running in gutter in front of the house.
But when you went down to the edge of the flood wall and see that mass of water going down and starting to trickle over the top, there was no disbelief then. It's here, and in order to prevent a disaster, they let the water come up through the sewer system to gradually have the water come in without a rush or without the wall breaking.
The most devastating thing was watching the water coming in, because they let the water in. You know, they just let it come in and over the flood walls, but they let it come in back in through the sewers.
I did recall seeing these manhole covers pop up several feet with the pressure of the water pushing it up. But everybody was, I think, aware of the fact that this is really, it's really real right now, that we got to get out of here.
5:45 p.m. We are definitely flooded. Now starts the hourly measurements of the stair steps. And may the rise be slow and very little.
I knew the loss was going to be great, but we saved the most important thing, and that was our daughter. She was about 2 years old. We saved her and her clothes. I remember Dad pulling a suitcase off a shelf. He socked it down on the bed, opened it up, and he said, "Now, put everything you want to save into this suitcase." Well, you can't. You can't possibly carry out in a suitcase everything you want to save. You have to pick and choose quick.
The husband was using his trucks to help the people that had no other way of moving their furniture to higher ground. The water was following us all the way up to Waller Hill. And by the time we got to Waller Hill, there was already about 10 or 12 feet of water in the city, and it was coming in rapidly.
It was unbelievable how that water came and how fast it came up and how swift it was.
Well, it was scary. You just wondered whether you were going to get out safe or not. Because as we were riding, the water was right behind us.
First water in the house came up through cold air register in the hall. Covered quickly all the hall. Coming into the kitchen, started up over the front porch. Doorbell rang. No one was at the front door. No one was there. Finally discovered it was the water seeping in and making an electrical connection. Very ghostly going on, believe me. Finally had to disconnect it. Nice of Old Man River to ring before entering, eh?
Despite the warnings, some people in the low-lying areas tried to stay in their homes and ride out the flood, unaware of just how much of the city would soon be covered.
With the radio, no TV at that time, of course, they had predictions of how high it was going to get, but I don't think anybody ever believed it was going to get to where it did.
Some people thought, well, it'll come up in the house, but I won't have to leave the house. But when it kept on coming up higher and higher, nobody had an idea exactly how high it was going to come. They'd only had the experience of previous floods, which is history is the only way you could study this, and it didn't seem that this would be possible. So I think a lot of people were surprised and increasingly fearful when it kept on coming up and there was no way out.
My parents didn't expect it to come in. The 1913 flood had not gotten in the house, so they felt, well, they were safe. And by the time they realized that it was looking like they weren't going to be safe, then water was over all the downtown.
"1 a.m. Water in the house measures 17 inches. Going to bed. 5 a.m. Water in the house measures 25 inches. Back to bed. 8 a.m. Water in the house reads 29 3/4 inches. Radio says river stage reads 66.2 feet. All we can do is sit and wait.
Act fast and don't worry. that was a main lesson. Act fast because do what you can. Don't worry about the rest. And you just keep going. So we couldn't go back into our house because the water, our house sat in water up to the chimney. You don't do much living up there in that chimney on top of the roof. So I just had to say goodbye to many things.
As the water quickly enveloped the city, a mass exodus of refugees who lived in the lower part of town began moving up to higher ground to what local residents simply referred to as the hilltop.
Everybody on the hill opened up their homes and their driveways and their garages and anything available. It was cold weather, it was January, so we did everything possible to keep them warm and dry and feed them.
it was January, so the weather, it was cold for people, and a lot of people just didn't have any place to go.
The Cincinnati Enquirer reported that a third of Portsmouth's population of 42,000 abandoned their homes in the low-lying business district. The hilltop was a godsend for the people who lived in Lower Portsmouth, as they hastily fled to the homes of friends, relatives, and perfect strangers to ride out the flood.
We were fortunate in that we had friends that we could stay with, and that was true with many, many people. You know, like maybe a household that originally had a family of 2 or 4 ended up maybe with 15 or 20 people. Actually, at a time like that, people were very helpful to each other, and they were very helpful to each other during that period of time.
A lot of the people didn't move out. They thought, well, it's just going to be a false alarm, but pretty soon you can see it coming up on the streets and everything. We realized it's time to go. But we didn't have nowhere to go, so we went next door, around the corner, and upstairs, and they made us welcome.
There were 16 of us living in this one house, all family. Everyone was in the same boat, at least the ones downtown. I guess what they said, 4/5 of the town was underwater.
We were watching the flood waters as they were going down the river. And as I was standing there, we saw a house start to move. And I turned around to my husband and I said, look, that house is moving. Looks like it's getting off the foundation. And my husband looked at it again and he said, honey, I think that's our property. And all of a sudden we looked again and the building went over on its side and I realized it was our property that floated down the river. It was a 5-room cottage that was right there at 15th and Waller.
During the flood, some of the churches on the hilltop, like Franklin Avenue Methodist Church, basements of the churches and the auditoriums of the schools were made available to people that had no place to go.
The parents of the children who went to the different schools got together and we baked and got blankets and things necessary. We tried to dig up all the toys we had in our homes, took them to the schools for the children that were there to play with. We did everything we possibly could for those that were suffering more than we were.
While the people who fled early enough made it to higher ground, many volunteers, with the assistance of the Coast Guard, National Guard, and even a local Sea Scouts group, a sort of Boy Scouts on the water, aided in rescuing those who remained stranded in the ever-rising floodwaters.
We brought people out of houses that we took them off of porch roofs and out of upper windows and wherever they were. But I remember one incident, we were told don't take any large animals because they could upset the boat and drown everyone. So the one lady says, I'm not going if I can't take my German Shepherd dog. And I said, ma'am, I'm very sorry. Now the Coast Guard had some larger boats. We were just using like rowboats, which would maybe 16 feet long and would hold 4 people, would be a pretty good load in there. I said, we'll tell the Coast Guard and they probably can come back and get you and your dog, but we cannot take you.
My husband worked for the N&W, and he was put in charge of one of the Coast Guard boats, a little bit to the discomfort of the regular naval officers in charge of the Coast Guard, because here was a National Guardsman in charge of them. But he knew the streets, he knew where they would run into wires, where there were things that would be of risk or hazard. When they came home one afternoon, he was very upset. They had been sent down around 3rd Street, way down on 3rd Street. These people were in the 2nd floor, and they wouldn't come out, and they had a new baby. And he had to get them out because The house had moved off the foundation, and they knew it was going to come apart. And finally, he had to tell them, either you get into the boat, and he pulled his gun, he said, or I'm going to shoot you in the leg and then lift you into the boat in order to get them out. And he got them out and brought them up, but he was very distraught over this.
We didn't think about being endangered. As kids, 17-year-olds don't think about that too much. It was just a big adventure, but we did realize that we were helping get people out of homes that might not have survived otherwise. I know sometimes we didn't get very much sleep. We'd go home and fall asleep and say, well, I better get back down there. And so I would guess it was sometimes as much as 20 hours on the street. I suppose it's like some of the disaster here in September, the firemen, it wasn't near as traumatic, but I think that type of thing kept you going, even though you felt like you'd like to quit once in a while.
The community came together very quickly. I mean, they opened these flood valves, there was water every place. If you look back, particularly study the newspapers of that time, they mobilized very quickly and very stoically. And you get the sense that these were people that were already kind of primed to disaster.
I don't remember us ever hurting for food or having any trouble getting food. I remember George Lance's little grocery store. He moved up on the hill, a little further up, and what he had, he was giving the people, kind of rationed out to the people in the neighborhood for the few things that he had, the canned stuff, so everybody had some around that area.
To this day, I will see people that traded with the store that have told me that if my grandfather had not extended credit to them and to their family through the Depression, through the flood, they would never have been able to go to high school.
Well, I learned that in time of need, you can always get help from your community. Because there's always someone there that'll give you a helping hand.
While it was not business as usual for the residents of Portsmouth, many made the best of a difficult situation. Some things just couldn't be stopped by the flood. The steel mill continued to pay its employees, despite the fact that distributing paychecks was more difficult than usual.
And they had a little boat over on the hillside of Gallia Street. On that side, you went down to climb the hill, and you got in the boat, and they rowed you over through the window, back window of the main office, and they paid you out of the window.
Water was pretty strong. We'd hold that boat, you see, and pay the man, and then they'd row off.
Prescriptions for much-needed medicine also kept flowing despite the flood.
My brother-in-law, who ran Worcester's drugstore, lived at our house, and then he would go down and get in his canoe and go into Worcester's in the top window and fill out prescriptions for people.
I'm sure we saved a lot of lives and a lot of suffering because they needed medication desperately, and our area was just one of 1,000 that was being hit. And if we hadn't had that 14 and a half foot up there with all that merchandise in there, it would have been sad because they couldn't have got it out of Columbus or any place. That was terrible out there and everywhere else.
While the city was relatively isolated, there was still one form of communication that helped contribute to the town's ability to deal with the flood. 1937 was the year that radio made a big impression on Portsmouth.
In 1935, they started WPAY, and it was, they laughingly called it, "We Pay All Yodelers," because that's all they had on there. And people didn't listen to it, but it was a godsend when the flood came.
it was the only station here, and back in those days, it's a big deal having a radio station in your hometown. You know, all they ever had it was these 50,000 watt stations strategically planted across the country so that it covered the farms and everything. And then along come the FCC and started letting people open up smaller stations in the smaller markets, not near as powerful, but it was our hometown station, you know.
Water entered the station's first floor, but WPAY engineers managed to quickly move its equipment upstairs. WPAY stayed on the air and continued to relay important messages to the city of Portsmouth.
Their engineer was Maurice Myers, and he stayed up there the entire play. I mean, water was lapping around. He kept them on the air, and that was Portsmouth's way to communicate to the outside areas, and it made that radio station. Then people got used to listening to that, then they started listening to radio.
Betty Jones, your husband says for you not to store any more furniture.
Picking up radio broadcasts for help. People needing food and heat. Made a list of addresses and passed them on to Wilbur Schaefer, who was taking coal and groceries to them in his John boat.
Police warning to all sightseers. Keep your cars off the streets. Stay at home where you belong. At 811 Harvard, there's a family without food. Tell Kate Smith that Mrs. Simpson at Mercy Hospital is in perfect health. She has a 7-pound boy.
Sunday, January 24th, 4 a.m. Awakened by rainstorm. Ye gods. 8 a.m. Raining hard. Official river gauge 68.68 feet. 12:15 p.m. Our gas has gone off.
The river continued its relentless rise as the gas company was forced to shut down, and families on the hilltop made more room for those who had abandoned their homes. The city manager appealed to Portsmouth to use the water supply sparingly. A local spring called Kinney's Lane Spring became one of the most popular gathering places on the hilltop, with residents lining up around the block to fill up on its precious supply of fresh water.
I remember the spring up there on Kinney's Lane, there was no water coming into town at all, so that spring, nowadays it's condemned, but there'd be long lines of people up there getting jugs of water and taking them home because that's the only source of water we had.
The famous spring was just down a few houses down from me on Kinney's Lane. I lived on Kinney's Lane, and everybody stood in line to get water, and the lines were long. It was extremely important at the time of the flood, naturally, since the water supply had been shut off.
In order to relieve congestion on the crowded hilltop, the city arranged for thousands of people to be evacuated via train to nearby Chillicothe and to Columbus, 2 hours north.
We went to Columbus on this train. I was very relieved when we got out of the water district, but the train tracks followed that river, and we were in that water a long time. All you could see was treetops. As we went past, we would see treetops. That's how high that water was. I didn't have much with me. What could I carry? You know, you flee your home, and you just leave everything behind. What was on that train? Birds, dogs, cats, animals of all kinds. People were in love with their pets, and they didn't want to leave them behind to drown, so they took them with them, and that train was just packed with animals. I know they left a lot of very important things behind, but they were determined to save their pets. That was a Noah's Ark. It was a real Noah's Ark.
While the situation was far from comfortable, many people managed to have fun, and others even took advantage of the flood.
There were two cases. One guy had an old beat-up barn, and the water took it away and left a pretty nice barn in its place. Another person that I know had the opposite problem. He had a nice barn to start with and ended up with somebody else's old piece of a barn. So there were all kinds of combinations like that, I guess, but you would look out in the river and hear houses, you know, remains of houses going down the river.
You know, you look at things a lot different at 12, and we were excited, and that's horrible to say. I mean, we're excited, and some of the kids in the neighborhood, gee, we couldn't wait till the water got in. Well, one of the reasons was that they were going to close the schools. And I was attending Lincoln School at the time, and we could just feel it coming. It was like waiting on the circus. I knew we were in for it because my father, who lived in the house with my grandmother and everybody else, decided he had to build a boat. And so he went down to Elite Lumber Company and got enough wood to build a john boat. And he was down in the garage building a john boat, and I was out in the neighborhood praying for a flood.
Well, we had a good time. I hate to say this, but I learned to play ping pong on a round dining room table. And
that's an achievement.
We had card games going every night because there were 6 in my family, but there were about 17 people staying with us. So we were just having a nice time all the time. There was a bread man from Huntington, and he had parked his truck up on the hill. He couldn't get back to Huntington, so he brought all his bread in and all his cookies and everything like that.
Miraculously, the Portsmouth community was surviving well, despite the fact that nearly 2/3 of their city was underwater. However, the flood was not without its tragedy.
Some of the stories were dramatic, and nothing quite so dramatic as Bessie Tomlin's story. She was 22 years old. She was on the run from an abusive husband. She had 2 sons and an 18-month-old daughter, and she was pregnant. She had taken refuge with relatives who were about to be flooded out. The siren had sounded, and they came along in those john boats to pick up people to transport. And Bessie Tomlin had the misfortune to get into a boat which overturned. Her sons were pulled into other boats almost immediately, but no one could see Bessie. Suddenly she emerged from the water, and there she was holding up her 18-month-old daughter, crying out, "Save my baby, save my baby." A white fireman named Walter Chick was there. He was the one that the infant was handed up to, but there was no salvation for Bessie Tomlin on that day. The 18-month-old daughter, of course, grew up and is still very much with us, living here in Portsmouth.
I was only 18 months old when I was taken out of her arms by this fireman at the time named Walter Chick. He took me out of my mother's arms, and then by the time that he went back to reach for her, her arm slipped out of his. He lost his grip, and she vanished under the water.
That story kind of got buried. What would have been considered a story of great heroism and mother love kind of got lost to time. It's, I think, very late in the game, but nonetheless heartening that we are telling the story now, because it brings to light a tremendously important aspect of that experience. A flood touches everyone, no matter what background, no matter what color, no matter what economic stratum. And the responses to that flood, particularly responses of the kind of courage we would all like to believe we would show under such circumstances, no color line at all.
She was so courageous, you know. She was one of the courageous ones. And in the act that she done to save me, Of course, she was expectant anytime, you know. My grandmother had told me that too, I remember. The flood took her life and the life of the unborn child too. But she did give her life, you know, saving 9. And I'm just so, you know.
By 3 p.m., January 27, 1937, the Ohio River crested at an astounding 74.23 feet, more than 12 feet over the 62-foot-high flood wall. The Portsmouth Times reported that at its crest, the river spanned an area at least 2.5 miles wide. By January 31st, enough water had receded from Portsmouth that residents were finally able to make their way to the lower part of town. The city they once knew had turned into a scene of massive devastation. The damage left behind by the river was staggering. A report filed by the Citizens Rehabilitation Committee found that the 37 flood brought more than $16 million worth of damage to the greater Portsmouth area. More than 6,000 houses had been flooded, and over 34,000 people had been left homeless by the flood. The story was the same up and down the Ohio River, where close to 1 out of every 8 people in the tri-state area of Ohio, Kentucky, and West Virginia were left homeless, and cities all along the river were faced with an unimaginable task ahead.
We're talking about a community that sustained millions of dollars worth of damage and in some real sense had to be rebuilt. You're talking about the worst nightmare most small communities can imagine.
I would say it's the greatest disaster that ever hit this section of the country. And it was at that time.
Leo Deal, in finishing his detailed account of the flood, wrote about what his family saw when they surveyed their home on the 31st.
We explored the wreck of what had been our cozy home. Our hearts almost stood still at the picture of ruin that met our gaze as we went from room to room. Mere words failed to paint the picture on paper as it's painted on our memories forever. There's only one thing to do. Get that thick, slimy, oozy mud out of the house.
The cleaning those houses out was the real problem. The muck, it was just a real fine silt, at least that deep in the first floor, and you had to get it out as the water went down.
That's right. That's what we
Because
did.
if you didn't, it was like concrete in there
That's
after.
right.
Mud probably about 2 inches deep all over the floor. And I remember we went back in after the flood, and my mom just broke down and started to cry. That furniture would just all come apart and was just laying in a pile in the floor, like it broke my mom's heart. And I didn't mind too much because all the time before, I had to dust every bit of it every day before I could go out and play. So, but that was kind of tragic.
I came down and I walked over to the basement and looked in the basement. I never saw as much plunder and much trash and wreckage in my life as I saw in that basement. And the stench was absolutely awful.
Everything stayed just saturated for weeks, maybe almost months afterwards. And then your furniture was a lot of it destroyed. And we were more tolerant of bad furniture than we were any other time because you had to do with what you could get a hold of. And the matter of getting the place back to livable was pretty important.
The alleys, for instance, were just completely disrupted. A lot of the buildings, which were wooden structures, I mean, they would be taken right off their foundation and twisted around and placed in different areas and so forth. And so it took quite some time for all that to be straightened out.
We had just bought a brand new refrigerator. They're expensive. and we couldn't hardly afford it. When that flood was over, boy, there wasn't much we could afford.
I think it's amazing how well the people did recover from it. And they were certainly resourceful and had a lot of energy.
I remember a friend of ours, well, my sister's age, she went to PHS, and she came home one day from school, and her grandfather had a bucket of sorts and was chopping the piano and putting it in this bucket. Well, see, he had to get a fire to get heat in the house, so he was chopping the piano and putting it in the bucket, but was hand washing wooden clothespins. The clothespins could be used again, but the piano couldn't.
Portsmouth recovered very well, I thought, because as soon as the water would go out of a business, a fellow would go back down and, you know, get his business going again.
Despite overwhelming odds, the community bounced back in a remarkable fashion. Portsmouth removed nearly 45,000 tons of debris, restored its houses and businesses, and rebuilt itself stronger than ever.
Although there was only one life lost, that of Bessie Tomlin, the businesses lost that had to be put back together in some way, the very fact that this was nearing the end of an economic depression, all those things would have broken the back of a community that didn't have some strength to it. I've always thought that Portsmouth should be particularly proud of the way it came through that flood. It had a kind of a can-do spirit.
Well, there was no time for despair. You had to act. And when you start acting, your fear diminishes because you put that first. What you have to do, you put it first. And you shove your fears in the background. You do what you have to do, then you worry about it later. Whenever you couldn't do, you worried about that later.
The spirit was, let's get over this and get on with it, you know. The spiritual part of it, I think, was great, really. People, like I say, taking in strangers that you never saw before, and trying to share your food, and this kind of thing was pretty common all throughout the period and the recovery period as well.
There was a time when it was doubtful Portsmouth would ever come back. But it did come back. It came back with a roar.
After everybody got all settled in, they just all went back to their daily routines, you know, and talked about it some, but a lot of people saying where they was and what they did and all that, but it just sort of a matter of fact, it's something that's a way of life, and they lived through it and thankful for it.
Well, I knew it wasn't the end. Yes, it made me stronger because I knew that even if you lost about everything, if you keep your health so that you can keep going, you're pretty safe. Because you can get back some of the things you lost.
Having gone through one of those things, you realize what's important in life and what's not. I think it does have an influence on your life from then on, really. I think it stays with you.
I think it makes you realize that things are not so important. As long as the people that you're concerned with are all okay, then it's all right.
The fright of it and the sharing helped to prepare our generation for World War II when it came. We were willing to accept it and do what we had to do to get over that.
People realized that they had to work together in a flood, and I think they probably realized a similar thing if they're faced with a common enemy for the entire country in war.
You realize that the devastation of what nature can do, and you had to pull together to survive. You had to share, and yet it was very frightening. So when World War II came, and we knew we had to do the same thing again. And I think the generation of my children have sort of lost this. I really believe that. So I think maybe nature really can be a help to us.
I don't know. I think, of course, people come together during tragic times, and so very likely there would be a lot of that now. It might not show when times are going all right, but when, you know, something as bad as that flood was, that brings people together. And if anything like that would happen again, I think people would want to help each other.
There are a lot of younger people that don't have any idea what the flood was like. And a lot of newer people, having moved in here with the big flood wall, probably never gave it a thought. But I know that the people who went through that, it changed their whole outlook on things, I believe.
You come to respect the power of a river like the Ohio, possibly any river, any stream for that matter, that could get out of control. You understand what happens when something like that gets out of control, and you better respect it.
I never feared the river before, but I found out in that experience that that river can be very powerful. Before that, you look at the river and you think it's peaceful. Well, it can be a terrible thing to face.
I wouldn't trade it for all the world, because it was, in its own way, it was actually fascinating. The different facets of it, how businesses coped, how families coped, how individuals coped, and the word survival. We survived, and it made us strong.
I do think people are like the phoenix. They rise up again and start all over again.
Shortly after the '37 flood and passage of the Flood Control Act, the Army Corps of Engineers built a new flood wall around the city that still protects it today. The new wall stands 15 feet higher than the old one, and including a levee system, stretches more than 7 miles. Although it has successfully kept out floodwaters, the new wall stands only 3 feet higher than the river reached in 1937.
Well, I think you should just take heed that things can happen in a very short time, and that you can't control the weather or you can't control the river. I think to a certain extent now that they have the dams and the flood wall, that you're fairly safe, but we thought that with the original flood wall, and it went like 13 feet over that.
Well, I imagine they thought that nothing would ever bother them, that they'd be safe with the little flood wall that we had. Never dreaming we'd ever have high water in Portsmouth. But I guess those things do happen, and we can't stop nature. After all, the water will come.
I got a boat, no time for sailing, and I got a kid, no time for play. Hey, just tell me that's the way to live. Hey, I don't lie, that's the way it is. Hey, I don't lie, that's the way it is. There ain't no time for being I gotta keep that on the shelf. There ain't no end that I can see, but it can't be someone else. Well, I got a wife. At times I failed her. Sometimes she don't like me. Can't say I blame her. Hey, you just tell me that's the way it is. Hey, I don't like it. That's the way it is. Hey, I don't like it. That's the way it is.